It's wonderful to welcome you this afternoon to this conference on renewing hope, and we are especially pleased that we have a lineup of wonderful introductions here from people who have supported this work, made possible our being here in various kinds of ways, and have a commitment to this issue from their own perspectives. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce our four welcomers. Dean Gus Speth of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I think you will hear from him tomorrow night, but he has been one of the leaders in the environmental movement from NRDC days all the way through UN Development Program days. So we're happy to have Dean Gus Speth here. We're delighted to have Dean Joseph Britton here of the School of Theology, the Berkeley School of Theology within Yale Divinity School, the Episcopal School. And we're also eager to hear from him about commitments within that school on environment and religion. And we are especially delighted to have David Smith from the Center for Bioethics, where we have our home, namely our office. And as Margaret Farley said last night, the Center for Bioethics is not only for human ethics or medical ethics, but ethics for the biosphere. And that's a very new and unique direction of this center. And we're very pleased to be part of it and to have our offices there. David himself is a distinguished bioethicist from Indiana University and headed the Poynter Center there for many, many years, and is now heading the center here at Yale. And finally, our other home, our grandfather home, you might say, of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, Don Green has also given us a welcome, which we truly appreciate. He comes from the political science area, doing research in policy and voting issues and all kinds of other, I think, relevant things to today's world. And we're very, very pleased that he has given us this umbrella home to be in. So thank you all and welcome to you. And we'll start with Dean Speth.
Well, good afternoon. I think we'll all be brief, I'm sure, because you sense the panel is ready to go. Welcome to Yale, all of you. I can't tell you how exciting it is to have you here, to have this event here. And knowing what you do, I can also say what an honor it is to have you here. I'll talk tomorrow night about the importance of what you're doing, but gee whiz, it's just great. And of course, this wouldn't have, none of us would be here without the remarkable Tucker Grimm team. We're blessed to have them at Yale now, and we've got at least 5 good years ahead of us with them, and at least. I want to just say a word first to thank Dean Harry Attridge for the partnership that we formed between our environment school at Yale and this grand divinity school. And in that context, to ask your help with something, really, we have a joint degree program between our two schools. You can get master's degrees from both of our schools, not in 4 years, but in 3 years. And we have these joint degree programs with the law school and public health school here at Yale, business school. But this one is very small. And what I want to ask you is to help me not only spread the word about this joint degree program, where you can learn a great deal from both institutions, but also get me some information that I can use to help spread the word, some testimonials of what it would mean to deeply understand what both schools have to offer in our world and in the future. And if I have that information from you, and you're helping me spread the word and helping Harry spread the word. I think we can build this joint degree program into a place that will turn out every year perhaps a dozen top people to go out into the world and help save it. Thank you very much.
Well, and a good afternoon from the Divinity School as well. As Mary Evelyn mentioned, my name is Joseph Britton. I'm the Dean of Berkeley Divinity School, which is an Episcopal seminary here at Yale Divinity School. And we share a very close working affiliation together. So it's both on behalf of Berkeley and of Yale Divinity School and its Dean Harry Attridge that I welcome you to these sessions this afternoon. Dean Speth mentioned the joint degree program between the Divinity and Forestry schools. And of course, one of the key elements to any degree program is faculty. And a few years ago, soon after I arrived here, we had a prospective donor who approached us about the possibility of funding a joint professorship in religion and ecology between the two schools. And I noticed when I first brought this up that it seemed like a somewhat far-fetched idea at the time, even though there had been this long-standing relationship between the two schools. But I've noticed that since then there has been something of an academic climate change, if I can use that phrase, and that quickly this relationship between the two schools has developed to a point where the idea of a joint chair in religion and ecology to be shared by Forestry and Divinity not only seems possible, but almost inevitable. I'm not ready to announce such a thing yet, but I can say that I believe that we're very close to being able to make this a reality. And God willing, within a few weeks or months, we'll be able to make a more formal announcement about that. This donor, in a sense, has given a great deal of leadership to us by proposing such a thing. And it has helped us to realize that the value of bringing a religious perspective to bear on environmental issues comes from the fact that it's, at its best, a theological perspective is perhaps uniquely positioned to approach what seem like almost intractable problems of climate change from both a comprehensive and an individual perspective. That is to say, a theologian is able to advocate both for a universal obligation to creation that intrudes into our sense of free agency, and at the same time, a theologian is able to recognize the specificity of legitimate claims of individuals within vastly different cultural contexts to have their own share of material prosperity and comfort. The religious advocacy for the love of God, in other words, which is a universal, is also an advocacy for the love of neighbor, which is a particular. And those two together mandate a nuanced and highly inflected understanding that neither the sort of rigorous rationality of science nor the strict determinism of economics can do. So it's the implications of such a perspective that I think you all are gathered here today and over the next several days to consider. And we welcome your contributions and presence in wrestling with those very difficult questions. So thank you for being here.
I'm particularly proud to stand in this place as an alumnus of this school, and I'm greatly honored to be on the list of people welcoming you to the Renewing Hope Conference. One reason I get to do this is something Margaret Farley mentioned last night, that the founders of our Interdisciplinary Bioethics Center had the wisdom and foresight to insist that our concern should not be only with medical ethics, but with ethics as it affected the whole biosphere. And the center for years has tried to deliver on that promise. And it's my good luck that, in fact, my tenure at Yale correlates with John and Mary Evelyn's tenure. And they have done, this conference is very obvious and very splendid, but it's just the visible tip of the iceberg of what they have accomplished and will accomplish. Something that isn't always noticed in the environmental movement, as I've seen it, is the role of religious thought and institutions. The political philosopher Michael Walzer once wrote that goods come into our minds before they come into our hands. Religious myths and stories and traditions have shaped the way people look at the world all over the globe. They've contributed to our problems, and when organized and rectified, can contribute to their solutions. Speaking only of the United States, one important bully pulpit throughout this country is the pulpit. To say nothing of educational programs and initiatives. In my opinion, religious communities, at least within the traditions of the Abrahamic faiths, have spent too much time in my lifetime, and certainly in the past quarter century, worrying about the small stuff, and let some very big issues, in addition to those you're here to consider, I personally would add care for the dying, let some very, very big, taken a pass on some very, very big issues. The task before us and before you is important. It may determine not only the quality, but the possibility of life for future generations. So thank God for Tucker and Grimm, and let's get it done.
It's a pleasure and honor to welcome you here today. There's a danger in being the fourth of four welcomers that by the time I get here, you're all welcomed out. But let me just say that we're so proud to have Mary Evelyn and John at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and has been committed for those 4 decades to fostering cross-disciplinary collaboration in teaching and research. And the kind of cross-disciplinary collaboration that we're talking about is typified by the kinds of activities that are going on in this conference. The genuine meeting of minds from people with very different perspectives, very different kinds of training, people who are not trying to take their disciplinary background and lord it over others, but rather to have a kind of fusion of expertise. It's fitting that this conference should have something to do with the future of the environment and religion within that topic, because I've always found Mary Evelyn and John to be something like a force of nature. You know, they kind of storm in, and they have such unbelievable energy and verve. It actually makes you feel as though you're a bit of a slacker, right down to the Al and Tipper kiss at the beginning of the conference. So we're so pleased and proud, and we wish you the best of success in terms of this important topic and in the hours ahead. And we hope you'll return to Yale early and often.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for these welcoming remarks. It brings me to a early line in the Confucian Analects, where it's written, "How delightful it is when friends visit from afar." All of you having come this distance to this place, and we are joined in this place by that which those who were here before us. So I remember the friends who join us more than their physical bodies, but certainly we in our bodies bring to this place, that friendship with the earth. It is in that spirit that I extend my greetings and welcome to this panel. My name, as you know, is John Grimm, and my wife, Mary Evelyn Tucker, and I co-direct the Forum on Religion and Ecology, and we both hold joint appointments at Yale Divinity School and the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. It is my pleasure then as chair to welcome you to this opening panel of Renewing Hope, Pathways of Religious Environmentalism, in which the panel members will look back over the past 20 years of work and thought in this endeavor. Before briefly introducing the panel members, I wanted to take the occasion to reflect on this setting of our gathering, to draw out what I would hope are some relevant thoughts. I wanted especially to explore some thoughts associated with the host institutions, namely Yale Divinity School, the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and the Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics located in the Institution for Social and Policy Studies. They are all lined up on Prospect Street, and cemented into the brick and mortar of their buildings are a number of positions, several of which, certainly not all, but several, I just wanted to note for our opening considerations. So a sunny walk, if you will, on a cool February day, as the dean said when he walked in, one of the deans. Last year we wondered where winter had gone to, and not this year. Regarding ethics, then, there are two attendant presences that seem like huge guardian spirits looming over the gates leading into our discussions, namely a duty ethics associated with Immanuel Kant and a utilitarian ethics associated with John Stuart Mill. The duty ethics of Kant, with its sense of the human always as an end in itself and never a means to an end, places the human legislative will at the center of all our valuing of the world. The resulting individualism and value placement following from human desire are now so troubling as we confront unbridled consumerism in its global expression. On the other hand, the guardian deity of utilitarianism promoting the greatest good for the greatest number has incredible traction in our all-pervasive economic, media, political mix. Our democratic system is built on a utilitarian intellectual premise that people should be able to do what they want so long as it does not interfere with the rights or well-being of others. Thus, liberty and the assertion of individuality have become the hallmark of our contemporary market economies and political democracies. In an easy linkage, the external freedom of the marketplace is associated with the inner freedom of our true inner self. Increasingly, however, the religions remind us of the complex character of this search for the true inner self. And now we begin to realize that the desiring inner self and the desiring external world are deeply interrelated, and that neither of them may be served when human desire alone is equated with the flourishing of life. All this, of course, on a simple walk uphill on Prospect Street. As we gain perspective, coming uphill, the impressive new green building for Forestry and Environmental Studies speaks architectural volumes about environmental management through eco-design, and the landscape plans tell of an abiding connection at FES, Forestry and Environmental Studies, to the land ethic of one of its most treasured alums, Aldo Leopold. Regarding environmental management, a particularly interesting Yale ethos has been evident in the National Forest Service. I mention the National Forest Service because the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies is intimately connected to that governmental agency through a son of its founding family, namely the Pinchots. And Gifford Pinchot's multi-use policy implemented in the Forest Service reflects a utilitarian ethic, and that ethic managed to meet lumber and forest product needs in the United States until after World War II. At that point, two issues surfaced which have drastically altered Forest Service and which manifest the deeper search for a religious environmentalism evident, I think, in these gatherings. These two issues are first a policy of fire prevention or burn implementation, and second, clear cutting. These two issues have religious and spiritual dimensions that are historically and ideologically more complicated than time allows for these simple remarks. But with regard to the first issue, we have seen the dimming down in the National Forest Service of what I might call the management spirituality of Smokey the Bear. This wise youth symbol has fallen on hard times over the past 2 decades as massive forest fires have occurred, and some of them have hit residential areas hard. The fire prevention ethos so evident in Smokey the Bear policies did not plan on the buildup of forest debris and understory tree species that, when ignited, reach into the canopies of the taller survivors of centuries of initiated forest burns by indigenous American Indians. Conservation visions now course through the National Forest Service that are much more plural and biocentric than the post-World War II multi-use and strictly market-centered practices, such as clear-cutting. While clear-cutting of timber areas is variously viewed among foresters, it is a subject that often challenges environmental sensibilities. A spiritual vision directly related to those sensibilities is the land ethic of Aldo Leopold. A forester educated here at Yale and in his National Forest Service employment, Leopold came to an understanding of the round river of life and placed the flourishing of the community of life above simple human-centered agendas. Leopold's biophilia came to him, he says, in a vision of the dimming down of the green fire in the eyes of a maternal wolf he had shot. Such dreams and visions are in the lineage of many of the forms of religious environmentalism that we will be discussing here. Finally, here at the Divinity School, 2 streams of thought that I consider when I think of religious environmentalism are the neo-orthodox theology of Karl Barth and the new story vision of Thomas Berry. In our classes here at Yale, we have bright, thoughtful students who are creatively thinking about environmental crises. On the one hand, some students feel the bedrock theology of Karl Barth's early 20th century re-examination of Enlightenment thought. Barth reasserted the divine word over both religious experience and rational construction of our world. The implications of that revelation call the community, says Barth, to maintain Trinitarian relations among humanity, creation, and God's presence. Students seriously wrestle with that call in relation to our current environmental crises, just as other students draw on the late 20th and early 21st century thought of Thomas Berry, who speaks of a fourfold revelation in the scriptures of the world, in the interior of the human, in historical reflection, and in the natural world. Regarding the natural world, Berry speaks of the scientific story of universe emergence as a major revelatory voice in our times. Thus, in a leisurely walk up Prospect Street, one encounters many creative voices rethinking environmental issues here at Yale Divinity School and the other institutions. And I hesitated to single out simply these few, but I was struck on my final reflection by the transformative distance between them, and yet their similarity of resonance, between duty ethics and utilitarianism, between efficient management and biophilia, between recovery of revelation and a dream of the earth as an unfolding universe story. There is a plurality of voices in this choir, just as I sense we have a plurality of voices here in our gathering, and certainly on this panel. And I wanted then to make these opening remarks on the thought streams that I see threaded into our panel reflections on the past 20 years of religious environmentalism. Where are we now? Our panelists in order of presentation are Mary Evelyn Tucker, Carla Pryne, Stephanie Kaza, Cal DeWitt, and Catherine Keller. Their biographies are online, but let me emphasize just a few following points, after which they can proceed without further introduction. Mary Evelyn Tucker, my wife, is, well, I think you see her biography online. She has a recent text. The what is that called again? It's worth mentioning. Carla Pryne is a 79 graduate here of the Divinity School and is an Episcopal priest living in Seattle, Washington. Since 1981, she is the co-founder of Earth Ministry, was its first executive director, and continues to serve that organization in a number of areas. Having recently completed a position as interim rector at St. Albans in Edmonds, she is currently on the National Board of Directors of the Trust for Public Land and is an advisor for the documentary film Renewal. Stephanie Kaza at the University of Vermont is a professor of environmental studies with a PhD in biology from Santa Cruz, California, an MA in education from Stanford, an MDiv from Starr King School for Ministry, and a BA in biology from Oberlin. That plurality of voices on the panel. She's the author, among other books, of Hooked, a book on consumption, Attentive Heart, Conversations with Trees, and with Ken Kraft, Dharma Rain, a source book on Buddhist thought on the environment. Cal DeWitt, no one has worked longer at the intersection of environmental science, evangelical ethics, and practical activism than Cal DeWitt. A respected scientist with advanced degrees in biology and zoology, DeWitt spent over 25 years as director of Au Sable Institute of Environmental Studies, where he worked to help college students learn the principles of Christian environmental stewardship. Carla is a highly respected ecofeminist theologian at Drew University. We're so pleased, Catherine, that you joined us in this panel. She has worked currents. She's going
to go talk down there. You can come here or talk down there. Whatever. I'm happy to stand.
So that book was about chi. And so it's easier to stand up here for the chi factor, shall we say. We welcome you today in the spirit of celebration. Celebration of the work that has been done and of what is still to come. Because amidst all the challenging environmental news of our time, we are in need of causes for rejoicing, for continuing, and for renewing hope. The work of so many people here, the engaged scholars and theologians, along with the religious environmentalists, is a large part of this tapestry of hope and renewing hope. We wish to recognize the tapestry, honor it, and encourage it to grow. The film we will see tonight is a centerpiece of this celebration of remarkable work taking place across the country. We extend a special welcome to the filmmakers Marty Ostro and Terry K. Rockefeller and those in the film who are with us today. Will Marty and Terry and all those in the film stand to acknowledge this great work? It's a new family of stars. We trust this conference will be an occasion for renewing and enlarging a community of commitment to future generations and to the life of the planet. And let us observe that future generations are not simply beckoning from afar outside this room. Rather, they are here with us, our students, our children, our grandchildren. And for me personally, I want to say that a singular cause for hope is our students here at Yale, and in particular, the work they have poured into this conference. A recent Divinity School graduate has led this, Tara McGuire-Canopik, without whom none of us would be here today.
He's been awesome.
In 15 years of organizing more than 25 conferences, we have never had such remarkable help and steady support. Tara has overseen every detail, along with 45 student volunteers, led unflaggingly by Matt Riley, cheered on by Rachel Holmes, who along with Georgia Bass has done all these beautiful flower arrangements. Please stand, all of you here, and acknowledge our gratitude. 45 students, how can you go wrong? This gathering today witnesses to the fact that while religions have been late in responding to environmental issues, and while we all acknowledge they have problematic, dogmatic sides, they are clearly gaining traction. This is because they do have the ability to change from within and to spark change without. These are not static institutions. Religions have inspired movements for social change as they did in the 19th century with the abolitionist movement, and in the 20th century with civil rights, workers' rights, and women's rights. In each case, as the moral dimension of these issues became more visible, shifts in attitudes and behavior occurred. And this is what is happening in the environmental movement, as it is becoming clear that human values have an important role to play in creating pathways toward a sustainable future. This potential was recognized some 35 years ago in a book titled Ecological Renewal by Paul Santmeyer, who is with us today. Now, every major religion has statements on the environment. Economic justice offices have been set up. The National Religious Partnership for the Environment has organized lobbying on environmental issues. Both clergy and lay are becoming active. Eco-theologians are publishing widely, and the greening of seminaries is being encouraged, as we saw this morning. A whole new field of study and teaching is emerging in academia. Many of you are leaders or participants in varied dimensions of this great work, and most of this has emerged in the last dozen years. That's a cause for renewing hope. Climate change in particular is now being addressed by religious leaders. In the Christian community, the World Council of Churches has been working on this issue for many years, and more recently, the evangelical community in the US and the UK have been speaking out on the effects of climate change on the poor. In September, the Ecumenical Patriarch organized a symposium in Greenland to highlight the effects of climate change. And in April, the Pope will make a statement at the UN saying that climate change is a moral issue. Moreover, the amazing news is not only that this work is receiving attention in the press and in the film, it is being encouraged by scientists and policymakers who are calling for the involvement of religious communities in environmental issues. I want to acknowledge, as you have seen, how this has affected the field of study of religion and ecology, for it was in this spirit that John and I were invited to come to Yale, and this was through the efforts of Steve Kellert and Margaret Farley with the Center for Bioethics and Gus Speth in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, who realized we need this ethics for the biosphere. Coming to Yale is part of a longer journey, of course, and I want to share some of my journey with you this afternoon and what we could be asking each other over these next few days. How is it that you came into this work? For me, it began some 35 years ago when I taught at a university in Japan. There I fell in love with Asia's varied cultural traditions and art, Zen gardens and flower arrangement, along with the spectacular beauty of the countryside and the mountains terraced across the rice fields. I sank into another kind of appreciation for nature, wild and cultivated, both in the city of Kyoto and the cycles of rice growing. When I went to Japan in 1973, a few years after the first Earth Day, environmental problems were still at the periphery of most people's awareness. In the U.S., the liberating movements of the 1960s for civil rights and women's rights were arising. And the Vietnam War, which had divided the country so bitterly, was still being waged while the Watergate scandal cast a long shadow across domestic politics. I needed distance from the upheavals of the war, didn't we all? Having spent my college years in Washington, and going to Japan, I vowed with all the intensity of youth not to return until Nixon was out of office. And so for nearly 2 years, I was fully immersed in a university in a southern provincial city that had very little exposure to foreigners. And you can imagine with my height, it was like Gulliver's Travels. It changed my life forever as I tried to understand these very different worldviews and ethics of Japanese society, culture, and religions. Buddhism, of course, became very intriguing. It was at the end of a week-long Buddhist retreat, standing on a train platform in Tokyo in August 1974, I read the news of Nixon's resignation. I could go home now. On my way back to the U.S., I traveled throughout Southeast Asia and India. I stopped in Saigon to visit a friend who was working in an orphanage. This was my first encounter with the environmental effects of war. The devastation of Agent Orange was evident across the countryside with its subsequent effect on people. The impact of seeing this war-ravaged country a few months before Saigon fell was almost too much to bear. This was only the beginning. For what has happened in the environment in Asia in the last 3 decades is almost inconceivable. The Asia I traveled through in the 1970s was worlds apart, as we know, from where it is today. The cities of Taipei and Bangkok, Seoul and Delhi, while poor, were livable then, before rapid and relentless modernization hit like a tidal wave, engulfing everything in its path. In many cities like Beijing and Bangalore, the tsunami of modernization has wiped away whole sections of the city, and the rapid reconstruction and growth of cars has left relentless air pollution. The search for modern economic progress has dammed the Yangtze River in southern China and the Narmada River in western India, in the largest engineering projects the world has ever seen, submerging ancient archaeological sites and uprooting millions and millions of people. The environmental impact was so great in both cases that the World Bank withdrew its funding. This progress had a price on people and the planet. This tidal wave of industrialization in India and China is changing the face of the earth and putting enormous pressure on ecosystems all over the world as over 2 billion people struggle to gain the fruits of modernity and the promise of progress. Should they too not have electricity and cars, clean water and computers? How can one balance economic development and environmental protection under these circumstances? This is one of the most pressing issues of our global environmental crisis, involving contested terrain of sustainable development and eco-justice. With a concern, then, for both environmental degradation and the consequences for human flourishing, I asked myself, how can I contribute to discussions on the environment, not being a scientist or policy person, but a historian of religion? What use are we? I realized that the world's religions might, however, be an entryway. For religious traditions that shape values could have a role to play in solving environmental problems. Moreover, it is clear to all of us that environmental ethics will be formulated differently in Asia than in the US, in Africa than in Latin America, and certainly in China than in India. And so we began to explore how these varied religious worldviews and ethical attitudes towards nature could be understood and then factored into environmental studies and perhaps even policy. This was the origin of the Harvard Conference Series on World Religions and Ecology, which arose in 1996. And there is one person I must thank for his unflagging partnership, generous support in that series, and that is John Brim. When John and I, along with our colleague John Berthrong, invited scholars of Confucianism and Buddhism to Harvard to explore these issues just a dozen years ago, this was a new idea. It took some lengthy discussions to bring people on board and to overcome skepticism. After all, they were scholars of complex historical traditions, translators of texts, and decoders of commentaries. What could these studies have to do with the environment? These conversations were fascinating. But the response was remarkable. Within a short period of time, we had a full cadre of participants committed to come from both North America and Asia. However, there was a hitch. No foundations were interested in giving support. It was such a novel idea for them that religions might actually play a role in environmental issues. The conferences were ready to begin in May and June of '96. Many sleepless nights. The invitations were out and the scholars were committed to come. In April, I attended a meeting of the Humane Society Board in Washington, D.C. And 15 minutes before this meeting was to end, I presented a proposal, shaking in my boots, for these two conferences on Buddhism and Confucianism. Rick Clugston and John Hoyt, the CEO of the Humane Society, said, "Let's do this." And we were launched. And we are thankful to Rick Clugston for our long and steady partnership. But the story doesn't end there. On a June morning, when the conference on Confucianism was starting, we had a call from someone inquiring about attending the public talk that evening. Afterwards, the same gentleman came up to us and asked, "Are you going to continue this for the other world religions?" We were so exhausted, we said, "Oh no." Well, he said, "This is too important not to include the other religions and to publish volumes on them." Now, if you know this person, you know what happened. And with the wise counsel of Martin Kaplan, this is what happened, and we are enormously grateful. For with his skilled leadership, other key foundations have also joined these efforts: the Conrad Rasmussen Foundation, the Germeshausen Foundation, the Kendeda Fund. And we thank you, Martin Kaplan, for your vision. None of us would be here without you, and Diane Ives as well. Martin Kaplan, please stand. You were there when no one else saw these possibilities. So with the collaboration of many area specialists and some 800 scholars and environmentalists, the 10-part conference series and volumes were completed with Marty's urging from '96 to 2004. At the same time, a 2-volume encyclopedia of religion and nature has come out. In addition, scholars have established groups in the American Academy of Religion on religion and ecology and religion and animals. Many of those scholars are here today, and we would like especially to acknowledge their dedicated support of this journey in establishing a new field of study in religion and ecology. From the time of the conferences to the present, you have made all the difference. Please stand, all you scholars of religion and ecology. In the last decade, these scholars assisted in the formation of a new journal, Worldviews, now under the editorship of Chris Chappell. From '99 to 2005, they also helped us to establish a major international website, which Whitney Ballman is so adeptly managing. Thank you, Chris and Whitney. We have been joined in these efforts by the Canadian Forum on Religion and Ecology, founded by Heather Eaton and her colleagues who are with us today. We thank you. And secondary school teachers as well are here who have been working on this, Tom Collins and David Strait. I tell this origin story to illustrate several things. First, the universe has provided the support for this work to go forward despite great odds and endless uncertainty, including this conference. Second, collaboration has been central to the forum's work from the beginning, building bridges with and across religious traditions and seeking dialogue with other disciplines, science and religion. It's still an ongoing bridge. The third, scholars of religion and religious environmentalists participated together throughout the conference series. This is also reflected in this conference and the conference volumes where engaged projects were identified. And while the alliance of academics and activists may appear unusual at times, it has proved synergistic beyond expectation. For example, Sally McFaig, in examining the complex problem of global warming, suggested last night that we need a new anthropology of the human to respond adequately. And what I want to say here is that there's two wings in this conference. Sally McFaig represents one, the religious environmentalists and the film represent the other. We can describe then what has emerged over the last 20 years as these two wings, the field of religion and ecology and the movement of religious environmentalism. The first I will call religious ecology for the sake of contrast and clarification. I use the term ecology self-consciously, implying the interconnected study of nature, species, and ecosystems, dynamic ecosystems, from scientific and ecological perspectives, but also including humans. I use the term environmentalism to describe the activism of a secular or religious nature that calls for protection or restoration of the environment in a variety of ways, ranging from river cleanup and tree planting, or, as we will see in the film, changing light bulbs and measuring garbage. Religious environmentalism is embodying sustainability in persons, building eco-justice in communities, and linking humans to the earth in new and creative ways. The Renewal film celebrates this. Roger Gottlieb's book, The Greening of Faith, has skillfully documented it. Religious ecology, then, is growing within academia as a field of study that has implications for policy and practice. But how does this fit into environmental studies programs? This is a big issue, in case you didn't know it. Within academia, undergraduate environmental studies programs are relatively new in many colleges and universities. And while Yale's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies is over 100 years old, its undergraduate environmental studies program is only 6 years old. Environmental studies has been traditionally dominated by the natural sciences, what we might call natural ecology. This refers to studies of the environment within the various branches of science, geology, biology, chemistry. These sciences have given us an awareness of the multifaceted nature of the environmental crisis. But now environmental studies also includes industrial ecology, social ecology, and what I'm calling humanistic ecology. All of these might be seen in a larger context as related to one another, which we could identify as integral ecology. All of these are needed. Industrial ecology involves environmental engineering and eco-design. It studies the manufacture and distribution of goods in ways to lessen environmental impact and optimize environmental health. The fact that a Center for Green Chemistry and Green Engineering has emerged at Yale is a tribute to the growth of this field. A third area of growth in environmental studies is social ecology, and this includes many of the social sciences, such as policy and economics, anthropology, and education. Finally, within environmental studies, there has arisen an area we could describe as humanistic or cultural ecology that involves the varied studies of human-earth relations. A robust field of environmental history has emerged for almost 30 years with historians such as Clive Ponting, The Green History of the World, John McNeill's Environmental History of the 20th Century, and William Cronin, one of the founders of environmental studies here at Yale, Changes in the Land. In literature, there's been a tremendous renaissance of nature writers over the last 20 years. This includes writers such as Mary Oliver, Terry Tempest Williams, Barry Lopez, Gary Snyder, Scott Sanders. And Orion magazine represents a key node of that movement, fostering a network of writers and grassroots environmentalists. We're delighted to have the editor, Chip Blake, and Marian Gillian, the force behind Orion, here with us today. In philosophy, there's been a vigorous 30-year development of environmental ethics spurred on by Baird Callicott and Holmes Ralston, and now picked up by ethicists such as Willis Jenkins here at the Divinity School. The study of intrinsic value versus utilitarian value, the investigation of Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and of emerging global ethics is part of the focus of these scholars. But I have to say that some of them, including Baird Callicott, have said this conversation is within academia and has not made traction without, which is why Baird Callicott joined in the Harvard Conference series and was a wonderful supporter. Within humanistic ecology, we are including religious ecology, this field that is no more than a dozen years old, and despite its relative youth, now includes several websites, 2 scholarly journals, a 2-volume encyclopedia of religion and nature, and a significant body of published literature. It embraces a variety of approaches to the field, from the world religions and ecology emphasis of the forum, to the study of nature and religion, to a more theological emphasis. And there are a variety of graduate programs emerging, including the one here at Yale. So where does this leave us? With, I think, a sense of renewed hope regarding the emerging alliance of religion and ecology. That is, because it is both a field and a force. And that is represented here. A field that is coming into being within the academy, that's trying to break down its siloed disciplines and enter into a conversation of shared concerns for a sustainable future. It is also a force of empowerment on the ground and in religious institutions for religious leaders and laity alike. We recognize that we draw from each other, this field and this force. The field of religious ecology and the force of religious environmentalism. We cannot do this work alone, but together new synergies will arise of reformation and renaissance. Some have called for an ecological reformation of religious traditions, which is clearly underway, thanks to the efforts of so many in this room. In addition, it is my hope that the pressing ecological and social needs of the larger Earth community will call us to ignite an even broader ecological renaissance that will truly renew the face of the Earth. And one of our greatest sources of hope is that future generations are here with us in this task. Let us continue with them together to renew hope. Thank you so much.
You think there's enough energy in this room to be in this place where so many of the mothers and fathers of work that I've cared about for a long time is really overwhelming. And the courage, creativity, and love in this room and in these last 24 hours is really overwhelming to me. Well, thank you very much, and greetings from the Pacific Northwest, that part of the country which is home to great rivers like the Columbia, the Stillaguamish, the Skookumchuck, the Dosewallips, the Duckapush, and the Hump Tulips. Home to the Chinook salmon and the steelhead, to the spotted owl, the marbled murrelet, and the orca whale with whom we share this planet. Seattle is also, as I expect you to know, the hometown where you can order a skinny, venti, half-caramel macchiato with extra foam and 2 equals, and you don't have to repeat it. But I digress. It is Lent. In recent weeks, we have heard these words from Christian tradition: remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. We know these words from our tradition. They are familiar. They are not new. What is new in our day, the Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew summarized beautifully with the words, quote, "We are now obliged for the first time in history to pray not so much for the protection of humanity against natural disasters, but rather for the preservation of the environment against its abuse by human beings," unquote. It is as if the planet herself had received the sign of the cross on her forehead in ashes. Remember that you are dust, from the hand of a priest of one species, the human. The title of our panel is reflecting on the last 20 years of religious environmentalism. Where are we now? I respond to this question through the lens of a parish priest who has had a lifelong love of the earth and who also had the joy of a several-year sortie as co-founder and first executive director of an ecumenical nonprofit called Earth Ministry. Earth Ministry's genesis story resembles, I suspect, the origins of many new ministries: grief, love, determination, and a triggering experience. In December of 1988, the oil tanker Nestucca ran aground and spilled thousands of gallons of crude oil onto Pacific Ocean shorelines. After 3 days of seeing photographs in the paper of oiled seabirds in the newspaper, my heart cracked open. I invited anyone who wished from the congregation to join me to go clean birds at the makeshift avian hospital at Ocean Shores Community Center. We prayed together, we went, and after 2 days of cleaning oiled birds, burying some of the dead, and on the last day, having the chance to go to the shore and watch rehabilitated birds released back into clean water, stretching their wings and settling into home. We were changed human beings and changed Christians. It was not the first time in my life that I'd been flooded with wonder, love, and praise. Any of you see the eclipse last week? As George Herbert writes, "Who hath praise enough? Who hath praise enough?" It was, however, a transformational experience for me as a priest, holding a dying Muir in my hands and watching her struggle to live. Something deep in me was triggered, and I realized that my love for and concern from the earth was not a personal matter and a personal spirituality. It was not separate from my ministry, but somehow deeply part of it. It was also a transformational experience for those who cleaned birds with me, and with their support we began a group, the Ecology Spirituality Group at St. Mark's Cathedral, in January of 1989. That first meeting, I asked what I think is the most important question in my ministry I've ever asked: why are you here tonight? And the 68 people's response to that question became the agenda of our first meeting. Each person had come through different doorways to the meeting: love of the wilderness, concern for the sea, concerns about factory farming and the way animals are treated, organic farming, links between social and economic and environmental justice, consumerism, and so forth. But uniformly, they had come to the church because what they were needing was what faith communities can uniquely provide: a place to share their story, to pray, sing a hymn, to declare their grief, and to hold out their love. A place to be together in their struggle between that wonderful and terrible tension between fear for the future and hope with God and in God for the future. In a sense, we were clear what we were about. We needed the Holy Spirit to speak through the Christian tradition, through Scripture, prayer, and worship. We also needed, following a very ancient practice, to wrestle with that tradition, listening prayerfully to how it was speaking to us in a very new world. As Willis Jenkins put it well, we needed to redeploy that tradition to help us find a way of being Christian that integrated our well-being as human beings with the well-being, the shalom of all created things. Within short months, our small group began attracting not only Christians from other parishes and denominations, but also a lot of non-church folk, many of whom were environmental professionals and activists who were drawn to a place where it was safe to talk about spirituality, safe to talk about ethics, safe to use words like hope and grief and love. They were drawn to a community where their work for the earth was blessed and recognized, where they felt that their small efforts for this river or that farm were part of something, as Thomas Berry calls, the great work. And soon it was evident that this work of the church was not exclusively or even primarily for the church. When I was invited in March of 1990 on the first anniversary of the Exxon Valdez oil spill to represent the faith community at a press conference, I was beginning to get it. The church was being asked to add its voice to a public conversation that was well underway and from which it had been, at least in our region, largely absent. The work grew, and in 1992, Earth Ministry was born as an ecumenical nonprofit. Underneath our work was a deep, if barely articulated, conviction that the church had a unique perspective and an untapped power to turn things around. Our dream was that the earth, that all that lives, would be taken into consideration in every dimension of parish life. Stewardship, especially with regard to grounds, cleaning products, and energy usage. Christian education, especially of children and youth. Liturgy and preaching, and not just on Earth Day. Thank you very much. Mission and outreach, of course, spiritual growth, pastoral care, parish mission statements. In short, we were conspirators trying to infiltrate the system, and we had our work cut out for us. In the beginning, we needed to make the case. In the beginning, we found ourselves being apologists, simply needing to make the case, remember what year this was, 1989, that creation was a part of Christian ministry and mission. That was at times challenging. On the one hand, a conservative Episcopal priest in my diocese wrote a letter to the dean with a carbon copy, that's how long ago it was, to the bishop, alerting them to a class on Celtic Christianity being taught at St. Mark's Cathedral, and asserting that the canon pastor is a New Age heretic, unquote. I did not lose my job. On the other, and this is interesting, a potential major donor, secular person that I'd known for a long time, when I mentioned that I was beginning a nonprofit focused on creation, worriedly she looked at me and said, "Oh no, Carla, creation, you're not becoming a fundamentalist, are you?" This was 1989, folks. That's how little the word creation was being used in so-called mainline denominations. We needed to make the case. We needed community. We needed each other. We organized something called a colleague network, a regularly meeting network of church environmental activists who had been working in isolation but no more. Mr. Smith and Squim meet Mrs. Brown from University Lutheran in Seattle. Across denominations and in some case across faith traditions. People were so eager to get connected. They needed hope, they needed resources, and most of all, in the midst of the deafening silence of most of their denominational leaders at that time, people needed this work to get named. This, yes, is part of the ministry of the church. This is what it means to be a person of faith in our generation. Those were heady days, lots of energy generated from a sense of recognition and gratitude for kindred spirits in the Northwest and increasingly across the country. We needed inspiration. Some of them are here in this room. Pillars we leaned on for this great work: Joseph Sittler, John Cobb, Matthew Fox, Sean McDonough, Jay McDaniel, Thomas Berry, Wendell Berry, Sally McFaig. You are a force. When the Body of God came out in 93, we stood in line with breathless anticipation of 10-year-olds awaiting the next Harry Potter release. We were hungry for resources as parish leaders. We needed it. We also needed the arts. We needed Mary Oliver and Paul Winter and the so-called secular environmental writers who write with such spirituality, so that we could be grounded, not in anger, not in fear, or even in the zeal of our own good works, but grounded rather in joy, in trust, and in stillness. In the beginning, we needed resources materials for congregations, what today would be called formation materials. In 1989, the only resource for congregations I could find was from Callie Irish, now bishop in Utah. She was then at the Shalem Institute. That was it. We found the best materials we could, and when we thought something was important that we couldn't find, we wrote our own. Food and Faith, Simple Living, Compassionate Life, study guides on climate change, handbook for greening your congregations. So what was the response in the beginning? Mostly enthusiasm. It was really fun. We got remarks all the time like, "It's about time," or "I've been waiting all my life."
for the church to bring these things together, which have been in my spirit all my life, but no one's ever said it. No one's ever preached about it. No one's mentioned it as the bread and wine are offered. So it was very heady. There was also, however, a fair amount of indifference. Our denominations were preoccupied, as has been so throughout my ordained ministry, with largely internal issues of liturgical reform, the ordination of women, and human sexuality. Hence, only 20 years ago, in most church circles, environment was seen as an extra, as something not central to the mission and ministry of the church. So where are we now? A lot. 20 years is nothing in human history. It's phenomenal how much has changed. Amazing. Within the churches, this work is on the table now. In the church, people like myself and yourselves are probably not so often having to be apologists. You don't have to make the case anymore. Perhaps because in the wider culture, environmental issues are no longer as on the edge as they were even 20 years ago. Nonetheless, this work is far from being institutionalized. It is a rare parish or diocese with a well-funded staff or program in this area. As a friend of mine told me 17 years ago, who got some money to work in a diocese and then the money got pulled back, they gave me just enough money to fail. This work needs funding. Then and now, lots more resources. You know, you guys are probably like me. You used to have a bookshelf this big, and now you're falling over them. There's so many books and resources for congregations and clergy, conferences, networks, websites, denominational resources, and documents are much more frequent and better distributed. When people ask, what can we do, where do we start, there's so much more we can give them. But I would say there's two biggest changes in the last 20 years that I want to underline. The church in the beginning was involved primarily in education. And again, I think Earth Ministry's institutional development mirrors well what is happening elsewhere. In the early years, Earth Ministry's work was focused in two main areas: individual reflection and lifestyle choices. What are you driving? What are you eating? How are you spending your money? And institutional action: creation care groups, greening congregations program, helping people green their lives as people of faith and community. While continuing this essential work, Earth Ministry has moved into advocacy, faith-based advocacy and systemic change. Individual lifestyle choices and reforming of parishes' practices are vitally important. But as Leanne Barris has said, the executive director of Earth Ministry, Congress and state legislators can wipe out 1,000 acts of Christian caring in one vote by implementing bad environmental policies. Under Leanne's leadership, Earth Ministry is giving people of faith training and voice in the shaping of public policy, teaching and organizing people of faith to leverage their convictions to make policy change. The second biggest change since those early years, I think, is collaboration. In 1992 in Seattle, the head of Friends of the Earth was an active Mennonite. The head of the Wilderness Society for the region was an active Episcopalian. They were open to what we were doing. Many other environmental professionals were very apprehensive because we were a church group. I would say suspicious is probably even a better word. In today's climate, collaboration and creative partnerships of faith organizations with environmental groups is much, much more common and very exciting. So hooray to Yale School of Forestry and Yale Divinity School, the Humane Society, for this conference, which is bringing together people under one tent of activists and scholars, Divinity School, foresters, environmental studies and policy, scholars from around the world, and anyone who craves a weekend in New Haven in February. And surely God sees it as good. So just a minute or two more. Looking ahead. Are we ready for a movement? Have we been studying and finding our voice and doing enough initial organizing long enough? Are we ready to be a movement? Are religious institutions prepared to seize the moment and to use their voice today when public opinion is perhaps more open to environmental matters than it has been in American history? And as we work, in some sense, to better institutionalize this work in faith communities, can we maintain our prophetic role? Bill McKibben, one of the great luminaries, I think, of our generation, actually preached recently, communities of faith, churches, synagogues, mosques, are the last institutions in our society that posit some reason other than accumulation for existence. And that gives them potentially enormous power to do the work of the church, which is to be subversive, countercultural, and contrary to the dominant currents of the world. And so remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Lent is a season that invites us to strip down in order to make more room for the power of God, the power of Spirit's abundant life to be released as a great river flowing through the city of God. Someone once quipped that penitential seasons are not about making us miserable, but are here to help us face reality. So many environmental concerns that only 20 years ago were considered theoretical aren't any longer. They are reality. They are the reality we must hold. The reality is that we are in climate change now. It is not a maybe. It is not a someday. You all are leaders here. You are change agents. You are metanoia spies out there to change the world. And so may your leadership, wherever you are, help the people you serve to live in that place where reality is seen, eyes wide open, but also what is seen, what is known, is that deeper wellspring, which, by whatever name it is given, is called holy. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here back in a seminary because actually I did spend 3 years in a seminary myself. It's my secret persona as a Unitarian. It's Starr King. But, of course, Starr King was part of the GTU, so you got to sneak into the Episcopal seminary and the Catholic seminaries and take Buddhist classes and take classes on Thomas Merton. So I feel that my interdisciplinary studies and environmental studies were well matched by my interdisciplinary seminary training. So I have come to reflect with you here a little on these 20 years, thinking of my own streams as others have. So let me say it can cause many identity crises when you're so interdisciplinary in your religious beliefs as well as your environmental beliefs. But they were pleasurable. I just spent a lot of time outside with the trees and talked with them about it. And I did notice, to add to John Grimm's walk up Prospect Street, the wonderful trees and that little garden arboretum on the way up. I sort of didn't notice much else besides them once I saw them. So please take a look as you go down. Their silhouettes are so clear and sharp right now. So 20 years ago, in 1988, I had already spent quite a few years as an environmental educator, working as the Director of Education at Point Reyes Bird Observatory, working with scientists, going out bird banding and counting birds in the lagoon and so on. And then I had worked for a few years at University of California, Berkeley, as the Director of their education program in the Botanical Garden. So I was a very confirmed environmental educator, and Zen was something you did on the side, and you didn't tell anybody. It was a little bee, somewhere tucked away, never to appear on your resume. So I was living at Green Gulch Zen Center and having this job outside while everybody else was inside the monastery walls, and going through lay ordination. I'm sorry. Thank you, Roger. So I can have even more presence. So I was living at the Zen Center and also preparing for ordination, and kind of simultaneously in seminary at Starr King getting independent studies credits for going to Zen retreats. It was terrific, really. But what I didn't know was that it was only just the beginning for me and for everyone else. And when I heard in 1990 about the conference, the Earth and Spirit Conference in Seattle, I was jumping out of my skin. These are my people. I can go. This is happening. Finally, we're all getting together, and we're going to hang banners of the earth and the moon and the sun in a church. This just felt marvelous to me. And at the same time, over on the other side of the world, here in Vermont, was a similar conference, Spirit and Nature, at Middlebury, that the Dalai Lama came for. And I couldn't make it to both of them, but at least I made it to the Seattle one. And we had workshops led by Buddhists. So this is where we kind of start with the Buddhist story here, is think of that little bee as a little grain of spice in the whole story. Remember, Buddhists are less than 1% of people who even declare a religion in the United States. We're not a moving force like, the World Council of Churches. But as a spice, we can add a pretty nice flavor in different ways, and people are interested in that Buddhist flavor, so they like to have us come and be part of panels and workshops and so on. So here I was ready for a job really beyond my environmental education realm, and I wanted to take my PhD and my MDiv and see if there was some place, like what Yale is looking for now, that existed at the time, and of course there wasn't. But I managed to get a position at University of Vermont when environmental studies majors were climbing to a huge peak, and they just needed somebody who could teach a whole lot of stuff because there were so many students. Well, so that was in 1990, and I came expecting to teach environmental ethics. My training really was in ethics. I had done medical ethics and bioethics and professional ethics and so on. But the philosophers didn't have a movement behind them. They had kind of dusty meetings. And I don't mean in the earthy, dusty sort of form. They just weren't on fire. They didn't hang banners of the earth at their meetings. So right around that time in the early 90s, as Mary Evelyn described, this movement, this religious environmentalism, was starting to catch hold. And after being lonely for many, many years and feeling like, well, who can I really talk to other than my birding friends and my naturalist friends, finally, there was some place to turn to. So I just kind of abandoned environmental ethics and moved straight into religion and ecology because they needed Buddhists on the panels. So from there, I'm very happy to say that I've been able to have a lot of freedom at University of Vermont to teach almost any environmental humanities course I came up with. I've done seminars on Gary Snyder, on food ethics, on electronic waste, on American nature philosophers. My most popular course right now is Unlearning Consumerism. And I would love to just expand it as far as I can because the students really crave it. So I've been able to teach religion and ecology among those. But perhaps of greater import for the field is that we went through a little revolution in our School of Natural Resources and Environmental Studies and tried to break out of the forestry and wildlife and fisheries biologies fields, which had been always concentrations. And a colleague that we had just hired in environmental humanities, some of you know, Eveylyn and I conspired in our quiet, small b ways to see if we could name a new concentration that would allow religion and ecology people to show up at a School of Natural Resources. And we called it Environmental Thought and Culture. Now look at those initials, ETC, etc. It's kind of all the other stuff. We thought we would pick up the people wanting to do environmental education, doing religion, doing culture, doing environmental anthropology, anything that didn't call itself policy or science. And that's actually what's happened. We're only in our third year, but I have students working on green burial, on women's gardens in Costa Rica, on food ethics in Vermont, on eco-literacy programs, just the whole range. But it's open anyway, which in my mind is a key characteristic of interdisciplinary studies. There's room for new things to emerge. So I like those initials, ETC. So in the meantime, though, the small b is still a very practical way to approach things in a university setting. I've not found it particularly useful to go into any faculty senate meetings or search chair committee meetings or almost anything else and announce that I was a Buddhist. So probably the best role for that small b work has been our environmental council work and our campus sustainability work, and UVM is really one of the leaders. And I actually believe that the campus sustainability work will be a friend and a colleague to much of the emerging work in the religious environmentalism movement, because the campuses are fervent. They almost have this as a religious charge right now to green their campuses. So it's the counterpart is the greening the sanctuaries and greening the church curricula. So we've been able to, do a lot of the low-hanging fruit around recycling, and we've got our energy campus energy fund now. We'll be able to fund our wind turbines and so on. And we've got our local foods coming through the dining services. But it's kind of never ending. Our president just signed the president's commitment on climate change and just finally developed an Office of Sustainability, and we'll have a commission on that. So there's no time to let up. So what I've found about this little spice is I've had to kind of keep it going for myself on the side, and that in itself is an interesting story. So let me tell you a little bit about some things that are happening today in the world of kind of Buddhism, Buddhist religious environmentalism, I guess we could say. There's not a lot of organized institutions to point to. We don't have major councils or nonprofits, but we certainly have a greatly increased knowledge and awareness among practicing Buddhists and among Buddhist leaders. I am continually bugging every Buddhist leader I have a chance to encourage them to talk with each other and build a kind of peer connection and a sense of momentum among themselves. But we have to remember that Buddhism in the United States is very, very new in terms of organized religion, and we have every possible Buddhism of the entire world has ever produced here in the United States, and mostly they've just got to get their bylaws worked out. It's it's at that level, how to do transmissions, what color to make the zafus, really pretty important establishing kinds of activities. So the environment is kind of down there at the bottom of the list. And yet we have a number of retreat centers that lay people come to, and they bring their environmental questions to that. So, and they bring their appreciation as well. They appreciate the simple foods. They appreciate the silence. They appreciate that people aren't selling things to them all day long. It's a TV-free zone. So the retreat centers have come to play a very important role. So we have this increased knowledge and awareness among people coming to Buddhist centers, ordained or not. We have some mature leadership among some of the Buddhist teachers, people like Daido Roshi, John Lurie, at Zen Mountain Monastery, who in the beginning at the Zen Mountain Monastery declared that 80% of the land would remain forever wild, and who has an affiliate environmental monitoring station in the Adirondacks that he takes people up to, and they do Zen retreats where they take out their little inflatable zafus and sit by the sides of the lakes, and then they paddle in silence and do paddling meditation and alternating with walking meditation. He's been a real leader among his students, but hasn't had so much of a forum among other people. But he's there as someone to point to. His books on the teachings of the insentient and his gorgeous photography, which shows his true Zen insights into nature, are all available. And of course, we have still Joanna Macy giving inspiring talks, and still Gary Snyder writing inspiring and beautiful poetry from his Zen insights. So we have some people to look to. I would say that increasingly we're seeing more citizen concern about things like food, and that links in very well with Buddhist practice, because the Buddhists have always been very, particularly Zen types, I would say probably more than anybody, have a very well-developed kitchen practice and long-standing traditions around vegetarianism in some of the monasteries. So this fits well with promoting food awareness to people that come to centers. And it's an interesting conversation. The people who come will then push the centers a little further. They'll say, great, it's vegetarian, but do you have a vegan option? And great, you're growing your own lettuce and produce, and we're having these wonderful salads, but, you know, what about your dairy? Where is your dairy products coming from? And trying to get them to answer these questions. Now, one thing that I haven't seen develop that far yet, but I want to give you a good example of it, is making the links between environmental work and social justice work. In the Buddhist arena, that's happening far more overseas. And today we're talking mostly about the United States, so I'm not bringing up Thailand and China and India and so on, but that's the obvious connection because the development questions are so unavoidable. But here in the United States, it's not as clear. And the best work that I'm familiar with is at the Center for Whole Communities, which is based in Vermont at a place called Knoll Farm, which was a land trust deed from a person who'd been a private farmer for a long time and wanted to see her farm stay as a working farm, but be of good use to a much wider community. So a man named Peter Forbes and his wife, Helen Wybrow, came from the Trust for Public Land and put in their proposal for this land and got it. Peter had been working with the Trust for Public Land to try and raise values questions among their staff for a long, long time. And, you know, they kept coming up with new things and trying new things, and none of it was really sticking in a way they were pleased with at the top administration. And finally, I think in desperation, after he had done a Vipassana retreat, he said, let's all go meditate together. Well, it didn't go over really big, but they did decide to try it. And what I think was the winning piece of this was the place they went to, eventually was Taos, New Mexico, where there is now an environmentalist retreat center, Vallecillos. And the cornerstone of the philosophy there and of the retreat training has been Buddhist. It hasn't been an invasive, heavy training. It's not a Buddhist center, but it's been a gentle support for burned out environmental activists. And, there's a little place you can sit, and the landscape helps. And they have regularly had Trust for Public Land retreats there, and some more Buddhist retreats as well. Well, Peter worked there and taught there and brought that model out to Vermont. And I was, of course, very happy because I was right there, an hour away. So now every summer for the last few summers, he brings, with fully funded fellowships, it's quite remarkable the amount of fundraising he does, groups of 20 land conservation professionals to come for weeks where they do whole thinking retreats. Whole thinking is their way of talking about community, spiritual value, and also social justice. They do not leave that piece out. And in fact, they're committed to filling these whole thinking retreats with 1/3 to 1/2 of the participants being people of color doing work with diversity and social justice action. And it's very moving to be in those retreats with them. And to be with the founders who say this must be the way we do this work. So there are small B efforts kind of moving forward in different places. So I want to spend a couple minutes about, where are we headed? If you look at Gary Gardner's 5 sort of sets of resources that are well described in that State of the World little booklet, really only one do we have much we can offer in the wider world of Americans here. Buddhists don't yet have a lot of financial and land resources, not compared to the Catholics or the Episcopals. They have lots of rituals, but not usually for the everyday person. Aren't so interested in a lot of bowing and bells and robes and so on. They do have some followers, but not really the scale of followers as the evangelicals or the other Christian denominations, less than 1%, the spice again. And moral authority, well, yes, people do listen when the Dalai Lama speaks, sort of generically. He's just a moral authority for everybody, but he's only comes here every so often. So that leaves us with worldview. And I do think the Buddhist worldview is really catching people's attention. And not necessarily adopting the whole thing, but seeing it in conversation with their own tradition. So some of the things that are being picked up by people from the worldview are very practical in an environmental sense. The law of interdependence perfectly parallels the way we think ecologically. Simplifying, acting with restraint and moderation, these kinds of old Buddhist virtues people are hungry for. All the food practices I mentioned. mindfulness practice has been popularized in the healthcare field, and I think is moving quickly into teaching and education, and works very well with environmental work. And I think also that the contemplative practice that's modeled by Buddhist traditions is more easily seen by people in America. There's a very strong contemplative tradition in the Catholic religion, and in also the Jewish tradition, many traditions, the Islam tradition. But because it's Buddhism and it's sexy now, we can see that contemplative practice more easily. So where I think we're headed, drawing on this little small b Buddhism, is in three areas. One, definitely the lifestyle change. We all know about the light bulbs and our food changes and so on. My unlearning consumerism course. Lately we've been talking about the field of plastics in the center of the North Pacific Gyre that's the size of Texas, and other delightful things. So lifestyle change means a lot of personal learning, what I've been calling lately the green practice path. It could be secular, it can be religious, but it's questioning, reflecting, continually asking about your own personal life and how to green that. However, we cannot just play into that, because that would be kind of reproducing the individualism that Sally talked about last night at an even greater scale. And I find this is really quite rampant with my students. All their solutions are consumer-based. They just want green consumer solutions. So the second very important thing is structural change. And by structural change, I mean political change, but also economic. And it isn't all going to happen by voting. In fact, I'm sure voting is only the tiniest piece of it. We're looking forward to this election, believe me. I was not able to leave the country, as when Nixon was president. But, in fact, I had to keep teaching environmental studies through the whole thing as things just really deteriorated. So we need new people at every level of office holding. And since I'm here near town meeting day from Vermont, I'm putting a plug in for local citizen participation, for showing up and talking about the things that matter with your local citizens. And, you know, it doesn't have to be legislated. It can be something we just start to develop in our communities. And getting people to run for office. One person from our local church, UU Church down in Middlebury, ended up running for the Vermont legislature and is a fabulous representative now. So getting people out of the congregations to holding corporations accountable with those stockholder initiatives. There are many things we can do at the structural change level. And those are the kinds of things that will actually affect many more people, the change in the CAFE standards for cars and so on, the pollution laws. So we can't neglect them for the lifestyle change. But the third thing is probably the long-term picture and is the hardest, is the ethical change. You don't really necessarily need people to change their ethics to change their behaviors. You can just put the recycling bin outside. You don't have to think about it a lot. But on the long term, that's what will carry us. And I think this green practice path has a lot of hope for secular ethics. And the Buddhist contribution I'm offering in that is that we have as its foundation empathy for the suffering, the environmental suffering of the world, a kind of principle of reducing harm, of non-harming, and the practice of being with that suffering, that we don't turn away from it. We take a sober look. And that the third, we take the deep view. The deep view is my new word for systems thinking, because I want to take it away from the engineers. And the deep view is much more ecumenical and contemplative. So taking up that kind of green path, you can call yourself anything. You can go to any church. It works well for a small c, a small j, a small b, a small I, a small p, pagan. I think with a real emphasis on complementing the lifestyle change with the structural change and the ethical change, we'll have a different story 20 years from now. Thanks.
While Cal is on, everyone stand and take a breath.
Yes, they all say yes. Yeah, good.
Deep breaths. So bad all the deans left.
Thanks, Cal.
Yes.
Is it
Rude, too.
No.
It's just predictable.
Thank you. Let's come back to hear Cal DeWitt.
I'm happy that John suggested that because apart from his having you stand up, I was going to invite you to take a field trip instead. But since you've all exercised now, this is the point at which I say, and that's what's going to be on the exam. It's wonderful to be with such fine colleagues, and it's very exciting to just enjoy each other's company and just to see the fruitfulness that has come from our work since we last met. Some of you, I know, are meeting the first time, but many of us have been together in all different places in wonderful habitats. Some of you have been out on my great marsh in Wisconsin, and have enjoyed going out and looking at our sandhill cranes nesting there, and going through my town of Dunn, and maybe stopping at the North American Pavilion for Tibetan Buddhism, which is located only in my town. And this was engineered in part by myself when I was town chairman of the town. We also have one other church, Good Shepherd by the Lake Lutheran Church, and we have 9 taverns. It is Wisconsin. 13 months ago, there was a tremendously important news conference held at the National Press Club. It was a press conference that made an urgent call to action, and the action, of course, had to do with global biodiversity and climate change and other environmental degradation that we really seriously had to address. In fact, the statement was made, we cannot wait one more day. So it was remarkable, but the most remarkable thing about it is that it was a statement made jointly by key U.S. scientists and key evangelical leaders. And it made the papers. I know you've read about it. And it was quite remarkable because it came from 6 weeks earlier, a meeting we held in South Georgia, a quiet meeting, not advertised. And what we did was to get about 30 of us together, scientists and evangelicals, just for a conversation. There has been a tremendous divide. It began in 1859 with Darwin's Origin of the Species, as you well know. It was a minor divide then because people like B.B. Warfield, the dean and president of Princeton Theological Seminary, was an evolutionist, and evolution was seen as a solution to the problem in theology of fixity of species, because why would a providential God fix species so that in a changing environment they might be threatened? And so it was not that bad of an idea, and Warfield communicated by letters with Darwin, and so did Asa Gray at Harvard, another Christian professor, and but of course, in 1925, with the Scopes monkey trial, the divide was really widened and deepened. And then, I think in 1979, with the rise of the moral majority, it was deepened more. And I'd like to say something about that briefly, and that is that in 1979, as we began to hear radio pastors speak about the Bible and about faith and about Christianity, most of us who were listening, we didn't listen for long perhaps, but we were, when we were listening, we discovered they were leaving out the creation. In fact, leaving out the words "the creation" has become problematic, not only not only for that moral majority group, but it has become problematic for the whole American society because we don't want to be linked with creationists, and we've abandoned that great word. So it is that 6 weeks before the news release that E.O. Wilson was there with us, and he was signing copies of his new book entitled The Creation. E.O. Wilson is the living Darwin of our day, the principal evolutionary biologist of our time, and the point he was making in his book, which is a letter to an imaginary Baptist pastor, is that we now have to offer the olive leaf, as he says, across this divide. So as we sat around this table and just told our stories, and then went for coffee and then went around another time, we began to feel like we liked each other. Now that was quite an astounding thing for everyone there. In fact, people began to remark about that when we got to lunchtime, saying, "How come we like each other so much?" And E.O. Wilson said, "I think it's because we're statured." He says, "We have nothing to lose anymore in life. We've arrived, and we don't have to defend ourselves. We can just say what we think. And creation, you know, is a great gift." This is from E.O. Wilson. Well, Peter Raven joined in, and Jim McCarthy, who is now president of the AAAS, joined in, and the evangelical pastors were kind of had their jaws dropping because the spiritual terms were coming from the scientists. Creation as a gift and so forth. And what we decided we'd have to do at Malhana Plantation was to write a statement. We left in kind of not deciding exactly how, but some of the scientists were saying, something's moving through this room. And interestingly, the evangelicals didn't say that. And so we all left, and we had to go back to Tallahassee to catch a plane, and guess what? In the Tallahassee airport, there we all were together again. And we decided what to do. And that was to have a major news conference, and that was held on January 17, a year ago, at the National Press Club. It was really wonderful. It really was just wonderful. I think something was moving there. And as one of my students said, as he was writing his journal entry from a great trip that I took with about 8 or 10 of my University of Wisconsin students, he said, I had to write this great piece. And I said, and what did you title it? He said, "To the Big It." There is a passage in Romans, some of you know that, Romans 1:20, that the testimony of God in creation is so evident that everyone's left without excuse but to know God's divinity and everlasting power. In fact, it's the basis for this 2 books theology, which really penetrates Judaism and Christianity and Islam well before the time that Paul stated it in his epistle to the Romans. The idea is that we know the world by reading both the book of Scripture and the book of creation. And it goes this way in the Creed, Confession of Faith of 1561. By what means do we know God? We know Him by 2 means. First, by the creation, preservation, and governance of the universe, which is before our eyes is a most beautiful book in which each creature is a letter proclaiming God's divinity and everlasting power. And secondly, we know Him more fully by His holy and divine word insofar as our salvation is concerned. Well, so the evangelicals are thinking that's what E.O. Wilson is experiencing. And then when I mentioned something of that to Ed Wilson, he said, you know, I grew up Southern Baptist. I know that stuff.
That's interesting.
It was great. So why have evangelicals and scientists gotten together? There's a history here, and I'm going to bring you back now to the year 1999. And the John Ray Initiative is meeting at Windsor Castle, as it does every year, with about 24 people, thinkers, many of them members of the Royal Society, and they think through deep questions on faith and science. And in 1999, what they did was discuss how it is that we're going to deal conceptually with this great environmental crisis that we are in the midst of, and how do we deal with it? And they were dealing with various terms. One of the terms they came up with was the term stewardship. There were questions about that as a good term, but they tried other terms and thought, well, this is about as good as we can come up with. Let's have another meeting at Windsor Castle in the year 2000. And we'll have Cal DeWitt come, and he'll present the case for stewardship, and then James Lovelock, the hypothesis guy, would refute him. And so I spent a half day presenting it, and he spent a half day refuting it. And then we had a theologian and an ethicist make comments for a half day each. And then they gave me the privilege of giving the final talk, which was the honor given to the one who more or less was convicting. And the reason that I got this is toward the end of the couple of days, Sam Berry, a great evolutionary biologist and evangelical, which is not an oxymoron, said, well, Jim, what do you think of stewardship now? And Lovelock said, I like it. I should say, just as a parenthesis here, that occasionally while I was living in the castle for these 4 days, the canon would give me his seat in the chapel because, of course, when you're a theologian, you have to administer paperwork and you don't have time to go to church. So he allowed me to do that. And I was sitting in his place in St. George's Chapel, and Jim Lovelock sat next to me. And it was rather puzzling because he had never expressed anything about faith. And then as we're walking out, I said, Jim, you were in church. He says, yes, I'm an agnostic. It's good to say that to an educated audience because you realize what that means. You know, most agnostics are not that honest to actually attend church. It was fantastic. There's something then that happened at that particular meeting at Windsor Castle. Sir John T. Houghton and I found ourselves by ourselves, and everyone had left, and we looked at each other. We had been talking, and he said, maybe we should take the long walk, which is about a 3-mile walk out from the castle. And we did, and we discovered we were talking about what we were going to do with the rest of our lives. And we're talking about the Bush administration, the U.S. stance toward climate change, which we thought was absolutely horrendous, the misrepresentation of science in America, and how evangelicals somehow were hoodwinked by all of this. And what we cooked up was the idea, as we turned around to walk back the remaining 3 miles, we decided we're going to have a big forum. We'd hold it in England, and we'd invite the world's leading climatologists and the evangelical leaders from America over, and we'd try to convince them. That's what we did, and invitations were accepted, and then, especially from the White House, they gradually dropped out until we got one remaining in the last week They dropped out too. Obviously, the word was getting around that you shouldn't attend this meeting. And but one of the people that came was Richard Cizik.
Richard Cizik.
He, on public radio following, many times said that his joining there and listening gave him an experience much like his conversion to Christ. And he went back, and he has, of course, been the great prophet to evangelicals. David Ehrenfeld of Rutgers says, today, in this age of misrepresentation and deception, a prophet is simply one who describes the present. And Richard Cizik was bold enough to describe the present. And I guess if I were to give you a charge, which of course I can't do, because we're all independent private contractors. But if I would, I'd say, describe the present, because that's the great prophetic witness we can make now. Does this have a history? Yes, this has a history too. It goes back to 1977 when I was asked to come to my alma mater to join 4 other scholars and 2 students to spend a whole year to think and study about what was assigned Christian stewardship and natural resources. From that came the book Earthkeeping, published in 1980 and republished in revised edition in 1991. And once that work had been completed, I got a call from Ausable Trails Camp for Youth Incorporated, who had just transformed into an institute, and they needed a consultant. And they called Peter DeVos at Calvin College, who was the provost, who was a member of our Earthkeeping team, and asked for recommendation of someone to consult with how to develop an environmental institute. And I agreed to do that, and after a year they made me director of Ausable. And what happened was, in the first 5 years, we linked with 18 evangelical colleges, and then I think it was 27 in the next year, 38, 45, 60. We linked with 60 evangelical colleges and universities, and the way I was doing this was to find scientists at each one of these places and have them tell to their constituency the nature of the crisis that we faced, but do it as a Baptist, as a Mennonite, as a Presbyterian, as a Reformed scholar, as a Roman Catholic, and so forth, so that we would not inadvertently raise the red flags. And that has helped produce the constituency amongst the evangelicals, because that developed a couple of things. One, this tremendous network of thinking scientific people who also adhere to the Christian faith pretty dearly. And another thing it did was, since we invited Jews, Native Americans, evangelicals, Catholics to come to our forums, what we did is we helped develop a new and refreshed creation theology, and out of that came creation care theology. Many, many books. I'm glad my wife is not with me here, because she'd say, "Cal, you're bragging again." It's a story that's really a powerful story, and the powerful story is, if you get people from all these diverse thinking groups together and work together to develop a new and refreshed theology, you can do that, and God will bless it, and you can make great progress. And this is really what is behind this great movement that we're seeing today. It came from that, and most of the people that started this movement came through that process.
Cal, you might draw it to a close, if you will.
Yeah, I'll draw it to a close. Amen. No, I've heard that said in churches. What has happened with the Sabo Forums is one of the great meetings was a meeting in 1992 which formed the International Environmental Network. I'm going to bring this to a close. And that International Environmental Network has developed an international body of evangelical leaders through the bringing together of 60 evangelical leaders from 8 nations and 5 continents of the World Evangelical Fellowship. And this produced the IEEN, which produced the year later the EEN, which produced in the UK the UKEEN, UKEEN, which produced the John Ray Initiative, which produced the forum at Windsor Castle, and the whole thing forms a great messwork. I have written this all up in one of the chapters, chapter 34, in the Oxford Handbook on Religion and Ecology, and you can pick up the story from there.
Tempted, though, to pull this great green train to a stop for a moment, and Jesus is whispering in my ear to do a Thich Nhat Hanh, and just let us breathe for a moment. Just 3 breaths, in, out, in, out, in, out. Well, it is an honor to be with all of you e-conspirators. And I think my task, which I'm going to try to do very briefly, is to say a little about ecofeminist theology from my particular viewpoint, from the Drew Oak Forest, where it's an especially Christian project that I've been involved in. Of course, ecofeminist theology suggests such a triple marginality, doesn't it? Ecology, at least academically speaking. So you think we'd really subdivide ourselves off into nowhere. And yet, in fact, the eco, the feminist, and the theology have together created a kind of, Trinitarian amplification. So it's been a rather disproportionate impact, don't you think, of ecofeminist theology within various forms of environmental spiritual movement. But what I want also to point out is that conversely, really most major feminist theologians at a certain point seem to have metamorphosed, turned into eco-feminist theologians. And this is a way of thinking about the past 20 years, though this begins in perhaps especially 1987, when Mary Daly, who was at that point ceasing to be a Christian theologian, wrote Ecology. That was a signal. And in 83, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Sexism and God Talk, thinking about a divine matrix, which was in a very profound sense the ground of the universe. But it is in the last 20 years that we see this tendency developing in earnest. And I'll just mention then, Daly, who will now go off on her own train, doing Quintessence, but Ruther writing Gaia, and God, Sally McFaig, writing all the books that have inspired so many of you here, and the body of God, terribly important to me in the way that it thematized a metaphor that had just been a fleeting one in my Claremont training in process theology. Elizabeth Johnson's recent book, Quest for the Living God, is deeply an eco-feminist theology at the same time that it is a magisterial theology, systematic Christian theology. Dolores Williams, during this period, declared an eco-womanism. Karen Baker Fletcher wrote Sisters of Dust in '98. Ivona Guevara, writing, as she said, between the noise and the stench of a very difficult slum, wrote in Recife, wrote Teologia Ecofeminista in '98, translated Longing for Running Waters the next year. And this list could go on. These are not all of the feminist theologians of the last 20 years, but these are major voices. So there's a non-accidental amplification of feminist theology itself that seems to have taken place. Why? Well, I just want to mention a kind of sixfold feminist theological criteriology, or just a sixfold orneriness that might account for it. These criteria would be: one, feminist theology is practical. It's aimed at enhancing activism and transforming our relationships in the world. Two, it is profoundly relational. It understands our relationships to be not accidental to who we are, but actually constitutive. Three, feminist theology is radically embodied and explored early that embodiment to such a depth that it could no longer be contained within the skin of any individual human, let alone female, body. Four, there's a planetary drive to feminist theology that connects with a global women's movement in all of its travails over these decades and internal contestations, and that planetarity carries a boundary-crossing impulse of eco-social justice, and therefore an issue-crossing impetus. Five, that takes us as ecofeminists who are theological always into the cosmological, the sense of really needing to reread the natural universe with the help of science, with the help of a science-informed cosmological tradition. That's why Teilhard is helpful to some, Whitehead to some of us others in that task. And ecofeminism, of course, in theology has been most assertively theological, getting a lot of help from good guys like, I'm thinking of Rabbi Waskow, who's here, from whom I first learned that the name El Shaddai, which gets translated the Almighty and is used to give justification to the notion of an all-controlling omnipotence, actually means the breasted one, and takes on the connotation also of the mountain, God of the mountain, but perhaps in the sense of the grand Tetons. But these theological criteria of an ecofeminist theology, or the way in which feminist theology irresistibly tends to turn to its own ecological implications, have also met with a sense of the problematic, and that within feminist theology that's more preoccupied with analyzing the social constructedness of our genders and our sexualities, and that's been a fruitful and difficult interchange that's still going on. Theory questioning whether in our activism we don't fall prey to identity politics, whether in our relationality and our sense of being embodied we don't fall into a kind of feminine essentializing, or an essentializing of the feminine as more relational or closer to nature. And if we do, that would be sad, because what is that nature out there that we would be further from or closer to? Anyway, and important questions, for instance, from Heather Eaton about the relationship of ecofeminist theology to globalization. In our planetarity, we can get romantic, dissociated in our all too pale privilege from the kinds of atrocities going on through the economics of globalization, with its major symptom now being global warming. And we are trying to do some global warning here. Okay, I'm going to stop very quickly to give us time for discussion. The good news is that ecofeminism has never been one, is indeed a manifold perspective, and has not been stuck, but incorporates these critiques and is sometimes working undercover without even that lovely name, ecofeminist theology. Lots of interesting new complex creativities emerging. Karen Baker Fletcher's Dancing with God combines process theology with quite out-of-the-closet evangelical theology with her African-American womanism and her ecology. Marian Grounds of Divine Economy combines a trickster Christ with a post-colonial analysis in an ecofeminist vein. Sharon Betcher's Spirit and the Politics of Disability looks at profound connections between the disabled body and the colonizing economic and ecological disabling of the vulnerable populations of the planet. So this is good book news. And is just indicative, I think, of rich complexifications that are going on within and beyond the academy, hopefully also giving increasing resistance to our presumptions about our global order. Gayatri Spivak suggests we mobilize the planetary over and against the global, which seems to be something we can capture in our computers. So, concluding, I might just say a sentence or two, so the sex-gender entanglements of all of our selves, our theories, our practices, our spirits, our spirit, those entanglements are going to continue to bring a particularly intimate energy to our infinite interconnectivity, whether or not we call that infinity ecofeminist theology. That infinity, however, seems to be that in which ecofeminist theology will continue to help us to participate with a vibrance that combines our most personal relational lives with our most vast cosmos-embedded planetarity. I can stop there. I can read a bit of a poem from... Okay, I'm going to stop there, and you will be the poem.